Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome for joining us, or welcome and thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Lorena Paglia, and I am the chairperson for the Sustainability Committee here at BritCham. We bring today's event to you in collaboration with the Built Environment and the Energy and Utilities Committee. The future of green data centres. It's a super hot topic and a really important one for us here in Singapore. From my personal perspective, working at Microsoft, whilst myself, I am not a data center expert, there is certainly a lot of understanding and importance of data centers and technology, their impact on the environment, infrastructure, carbon footprint, energy usage, as well as what else needs to be considered with data and the future as we work towards the road to net zero. What we're seeing here in Singapore, the next big bet is data storage and management, with the development of digital districts such as Punggol and also the proliferation of data centres all over the island. What we're going to be covering in today's session is Singapore's plans for the DC industry, the energy challenges, how providers are rising to the challenge, and also how we can, in Singapore, continue to play a leading role here in the global industry without running out of some of the power that's needed to support it. As part of this, I'm going to hand you over to, you're going to be in very good hands with a great panel we have with us today. So we have Paul Curry from Mott MacDonald as our moderator. We have Professor Po Sang Lee as a part of the Energy Studies Institute, Dennis Wee from Keppel Data Centres, and then also Andrew Roche, who's joining us from Ashurst. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Paul.
Right, thank you, Lorena, and good evening and good morning to everybody. My name is Paul Curry. I'm an energy sector leader at Singapore for Mott MacDonald in Singapore. Today, representing the BritCham Energy and Utilities Committee for this absolutely wonderful session. We've got to talk about the future of green data centres. This is truly a relevant topic to many of the different sectors that the Chamber is focused on, and that's been reflected by the joint hosting of this session with the Energy and Utilities panel, the Built Environment panel, and the Sustainability Committee. Now, in terms of sustainability, the joint effort of Built Environment and Energy really reflects the fundamental sides of the sustainability equations for data centres. We're talking about the demand side technology investments to improve efficiency of data centres and address some of the carbon footprint challenges in Singapore. And we're also talking about dealing with the supply side constraints that exist in Singapore. And these will continue to be stretched, both in terms of the transmission system and also the sustainability of the actual energy supply itself. I won't spend too much time setting the scene today, as we have a genuine leading mind on data centers to do that. But as we move into the session, I'm sure we're going to have plenty of questions on our mind that will be covered off in the session. But of course, we have the Q&A facility available. So if you do have questions, please feel free to add them in there. Now, as I said, I'm not going to spend too much time setting the scene. I'm going to give you some of the questions which I often think about when it comes to data centers. So we all know that the exponential growth in data centers worldwide is really fueling this huge increase in energy demand and carbon footprint. And this is despite the energy efficiency improvements that are really driving the power usage of efficiency of data centers downwards. And of course, with that increasing demand, Singapore is a very attractive market for data centers. But we have a very unique situation going on here. It is very space constrained. We have a tropical environment, which creates additional challenges for energy demand. And of course, in Singapore, there is a very gas-powered generation system. And so we are going to tap out that ability to source renewable energy directly from the grid here in Singapore. So clearly, we know that developers are looking at demand-side solutions to improve efficiency, and they apply across the region, not just here. But with the emergence of these hyperscale data centers, despite this downward demand in the PUE, we are seeing an increasing energy demand. And of course, space constraint means building upwards, which puts further pressure on the energy usage of these data centers. And even if we look at a project in Singapore, which has been co-invested by the government to improve the cooling efficiency, we're still seeing, in that particular data center, we're seeing demand in excess of 150 megawatts. And what does this mean for Singapore's green plan in general? And what does it mean for the data center's own sustainability objectives? The answer to the first question is pretty obvious. We have a moratorium on data centers at the moment. But we need to find a solution to that, and that's what some of the things we're going to touch on today. And in Singapore, even though it was developed grid, continued growth in data centers will have a significant implication on the energy system. And so, as well as policy for demand side efficiency, we need to think about policy for areas on the supply side, energy management, and what can be done to support the power system supply. And with all this in mind, how does Singapore stay competitive in the data center market, especially given the fact that we have this current fleet of gas power generations? And what opportunities does this mean in Singapore in this for industry in this truly exciting space? So to start answering all of these questions and put it into context, I'm going to introduce you to P.S. Lee. Amongst a raft of credentials, which is genuinely as long as my arm, P.S. is the Executive Director on the Energy Studies Institute, as well as being an Associate Professor in US in the Department of Mechanical Engineering. With over 150 publications dealing with energy efficiency, he is an absolute authority in data centers. And so he's going to set the scene for what the demand for data centers in Singapore and what sustainability issues need to be addressed, and start looking at pathways forward for Singapore to lift the moratorium and focus on green development of the data center industry. So with that, I'm handing over to PS.
Thank you, Paul. First, I'd like to also thank you, BritCham, for giving me this opportunity to share my perspective on sustainable tropical data center. Let me share my screen. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Yeah. So I'll be presenting a few slides on the lessons learned from Singapore moratorium. So I think based on the various market reports, so the Southeast Asia is seen to be the region that will experience the fastest growth rate for co-location data center, at least over the next 5 years. So if you look at this, the figure on the right, it's actually showing that Southeast Asia is expected to experience a compound annual growth rate of close to 13%. And if you look at the wider APEC region, right, in 2024, it's actually expected to exceed the market of North America, right, becoming the largest in the world, right, with a market size of US $28 billion. So there are a couple of reasons leading to this rapid growth in the data center in this part of the world, right? So certainly there's the acceleration of the transformation to the digital economy brought forward by the pandemics. But at the same time, if you look at the population in Southeast Asia, right, so it's actually a huge amount, and they are actually consuming a very large amount of digital content. So at the back end, we do require critical IT infrastructure, including the data centers. But associated with the rapid growth of data center, there's actually the issues of the energy consumption. So I'll probably skip this slide in the interest of time. Let me go directly to the implication in terms of the energy consumption and the associated carbon footprint. So according to the International Energy Agency, data centers are already accounting for 200 terawatt hours per year in the energy consumption, which is about 1% of the total electricity demand worldwide. And if you look at the associated carbon footprint, it's actually between 1 to 2%. So if we don't actually manage this in a sustainable fashion, so this will obviously becomes a big issue, right? Especially for the country like Singapore. So based on the latest figures that has been kind of published by the government. So the Singapore data center industry is really consuming 7% of our peak electricity demand, so which is actually way higher compared to the rest of the world. And then associated with that, obviously, is actually the very significant carbon footprint. I think that also explains why there's currently a moratorium in place, right? So if you look at the number of data centers in Singapore, there are about 60, and some of the numbers is actually closer to like 76. Okay, and the data center industry is expected to grow at about 5% until 2024. And I briefly mentioned the data center industry is a very energy and water intensive user, right? And currently it's already accounting for 7%. And if we don't actually manage this, I think based on the projections, right, it can go up to as high as 12% in a couple of years. And this is actually compounded by the fact that we are having very challenging hot and humid tropical climatic condition, right? Meaning that between 35 to 40% of the energy consumed by the data center actually goes towards powering the cooling systems. See, while Singapore's energy is primarily generated using the natural gas, there's still the associated carbon footprint because natural gas is still a fossil fuel. So that's why we need to really look at the various pathways to decarbonize our data center industries. So it's well known that Singapore currently have a implicit moratorium on new data centers, right? So in 2019, the Singapore government actually imposed this due to concerns over the industry carbon footprint. And according to data center dynamics, the moratorium could last until the 2021 or 2022, right? Likely will be because now it's almost towards the tail end of 2021. So I think likely we may see a decision from the government next year. So this is basically to buy time for the government to reassess the DC industry, as well as to allow the DC industry to come up with new and more energy efficient power and cooling solutions. So, but this is not unique to Singapore. Moratorium was applied elsewhere in the world as well. For example, at Amsterdam, the Netherlands, back in July 2019, again due to the strains on the property market as well as the power of the network. So the ban was actually lifted after a year under conditions such as locating data center in specific zones with limits on power use and floor space. So this could also likely be an implication leading to the lifting of the moratorium here in Singapore. But what does the moratorium mean for Southeast Asia? So investors will need to question whether other Southeast Asian countries may be viable alternative for them. Right? For other countries, obviously the upside, there's an upside, right? In the sense that they are able to attract more projects that might otherwise have located in Singapore. And for Singapore, there are obviously the opportunity cost, right? And at least in three aspects. First, investment will be lost due to the moratorium because data centers, operators, investors who are keen to enter the Singapore market can't do so, right? Then there's also a loss of job creation opportunity in the industry. And thirdly, the reduction in the long run competitiveness for what is an increasingly critical service. But the positive side is the moratorium can actually spur innovations within the Singapore DC industry, making Singapore a world leader in terms of compute density, energy use, and sustainability. So I think later on, Dennis will share more about the initiative taken by Keppel Data Center. So I probably will not go into the full details. Yeah. Okay. So how can them unlock the Singapore data center industry moratorium, right? So I think it's clear that Singapore has become highly competitive in the global data center market, right? Due to various reasons, right? One of which is actually the concentration of subsea cables. So the current moratorium is a clear and present risk to the local competitiveness, right? Furthermore, our global society has become very data reliant, right, with expensive adoption of advanced data collections and analytical capabilities. So data centers have become an increasingly critical IT infrastructure supporting the digital economy. So it's not so much a question of whether the moratorium will be lifted, but one around the timing and condition for it to happen. Okay, so what are one of the key determinants, right, for the resumptions of growth for Singapore DC industries? I think that would be actually the technology, right? So there can be actually different technology options, right? I think, but one area is actually really looking at circular data centers, right? For example, can we actually harvest cold energies from other applications and actually use it for cooling data centers? Then things like, for example, instead of having the conventional above ground data center, what about having underground data centers? And instead of discharging waste heat from data centers to the ambient air, how about actually discharging it to seawater, right? So I think we need to be actually innovative, right, in order to extract the best possible synergy, right, by coupling different applications or different industry, right? So as to pretty much convert some of the waste resources into useful resources for example, for data centers consumptions. So I already mentioned there are different pathways, but I think in the interest of time, I'll just skip this. I think Dennis will actually provide a little bit more details later on. Maybe I think for the next minute or so, just quickly talk about some of the solutions that my group at NUS and my startup Coolers DC have been developing over the last couple of years. Right? So basically, we're developing a chillerless, high-efficiency liquid cooling systems, which can be actually integrated into a reactor. And why we're actually doing so is because the conventional implementation of a liquid cooling is actually quite painful to use because there's a lot of site work, right? Meaning I need to, for example, lay piping systems, connecting from the coolant distribution unit to individual racks. So to really make the liquid cooling easy to use and facilitate is wide adoption. That's why we thought actually going with a rack-based solution is actually the way to go. So this is actually a test-bed systems that we're having at a major co-location, the DC sites. So we are doing a side-by-side comparison between an air-cooled rack versus a liquid-cooled rack. So let me just quickly show you some quick results before I end my presentation. So we have actually demonstrated beyond the significant savings in terms of the cooling systems, we are able to also slash the IT power consumption because once the chip is actually operated at a much lower temperature, for example, 40 or 50 degrees lower than what conventional air cooling is able to achieve, right? Then you get the chip to actually operate in a very efficient manner, and the outcome is actually the power chip or the server power consumption is going to drop very significantly. And we actually demonstrated that we are able to slash the server power consumption by as much as 30%, for example, under 60% loading condition. The other solutions, for example, the use of AI or machine learning to actually increase the operational energy efficiency, right, as demonstrated by Google. So I think last one, I'd just like to show an initiative that we are working together with Keppel Data Centers as well as Facebook, right? So we have this Sustainable Tropical Data Center Testbed Initiative, which is actually co-funded by our National Research Foundation as well as Facebook. Right? So I think we're actually working together to de-risk various new and innovative sustainable tropical data center cooling solutions. And through the close partnership with the data center industry players, we hope to really proliferate such solutions, right? Helping to decarbonize data center operating in the tropics. So with that, I think I will pass the time back to the moderator.
Thanks, PS. Excellent. So appreciate that PS had to run quite quickly through his slides. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to, as I said earlier, use the Q&A and we can start to look at them in the Q&A session, which will follow the three panelists' opening remarks. So during that session, PS started to touch on the fact that there does need to be investment in technology and technical standards in Singapore to really lift the moratorium, and presented a few excellent case studies on that. So to carry on this trend, I want to now introduce you to Dennis Wee from Keppel Data Centers, who will talk a little bit more about some of the solutions that Keppel is looking at, particularly on energy supply side. So just about Dennis before we crack on, with a successful career in research and development for technologies for data centers, he's got more than 20 years experience in actually working cloud computing and data centers, and is now the head of innovation at Keppel Data Centers, so is ideally placed to talk about some of the work Keppel has been doing at the forefront of innovation. And Keppel itself has been investing in co-location data centers in multiple countries around the world with a very strong focus on the technology solutions. So over to you, Dennis.
All right, thank you, Paul. Allow me to share my slides. Okay, can you see my slides? Is this good to go?
All good.
Yes, good to go.
All right, great, thanks. Very good afternoon to everybody from Singapore. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to share basically what Keppel Data Center is doing with regards to decarbonizing our assets. For a start, our focus is primarily in Singapore. Yes, whatever we learn here in Singapore, we do have intention to apply overseas wherever we are. Right. A little bit of preview. All right. For me, I head the innovation division within Keppel Data Centers. My past life I've been very much involved in efficiency, looking at ways in which we can run the PUE numbers for data centers down as much as possible. So some of the notable projects that I have done in terms of conceptual studies and so forth will be things like the high-rise green data center project, the floating data center project, and some other projects that there was also announced to be things like a tropical data center 1.0. That basically we operate a data center that's running at ambient temperature in Singapore. All right. So I'm still working very closely with the National University of Singapore together with SLNG, Singapore Liquid Natural Gas Plant, to look at ways in which we can harness co-energy from SLNG, basically use this co-energy to cool data centers. So the third one will probably signify, besides going up high rise, besides floating, is there a possibility for us to build underground? So I've also completed a study together with our JTC, one of the government agencies here in Singapore. So the thing I'd like to highlight that efficiency at the end of the day will help lower PUE. Okay, but then on the other hand, data centers can only be as green as the grid power it consumes. This is for the case of Singapore. In Singapore, I think 95% of our power plants here basically consume hydrocarbons, which is natural gas. So there are quite a fair amount of footprint associated with natural gas combustion, even though natural gas does burn cleaner than coal. All right. For that matter, some of the climate awareness thoughts that we have, all right, in terms of power consumption for data centers as a whole across island Singapore, we do see that scaling up quite rapidly. Okay, we are looking at by 2030, we estimate that it will land at about 1.2 gigawatts here in Singapore. In terms of carbon constraints and limited renewables, like what I've shared just now, so 95% of our power plants, or the power from our grids are from natural gas combustion. And just for the record, okay, for every megawatt of power consumed by the DCs in Singapore, so we are contributing close to about 3,750 tons of CO2 annually. So it's quite mind-boggling here. All right. Next, we have got the tech giants' green ambitions. I think there are a fair bit of announcements that's already gone out. AWS wanting to go carbon neutral by 2030. Microsoft wanting to go carbon negative by 2030. Right? Google. Right? They made a very bold statement. They want to go fossil fuel free by 2030. Now, is this possible for Singapore? We're in 2021 now. So how are we going to achieve this if you don't have a solution or something that we, we're unable to demonstrate to clients like, the tech giants? Okay, so we need a solution, something to demonstrate that we are working towards this green pathway. So some of the activities that we are working on now will be, for example, in the short term, we are looking at importing green electrons from neighboring countries. This is what we are working on now. And in longer term, we would like to establish a very steady supply of green H2 supply system into Singapore. Okay, basically H2 in its gaseous form, we are looking at using it to combust for combustion purposes to generate the much needed green electrons. Like I say, short-term goal, okay, green energy import, be it from solar, hydro, or wind from neighboring countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, and further down south, probably from Australia as well, which we are talking to, a company called Sun Cable. All right, so it's a really exciting time that we have this opportunity to actually bring in renewable energy import into Singapore. So we are looking to this timeline of before 2026. All right, and then in the longer term, like I said, supply chain infrastructure for H2 hydrogen. So we are looking to this timeline of 2027, 2028. Right. So in terms of the hydrogen pathway, the hydrogen supply chain, we have made a couple of announcements here in Singapore. So to start off with, our focus is on the upstream, the midstream, as well as the downstream. So I've talked about the downstream with regards to the floating data center, the high-rise feasibility study project, and so forth that we have done. But these are being considered into an actual project that's we are working towards implementing it here in Singapore. All right, but having said that, we still have this challenge of the carbon footprint. That's where this consortium of companies from which we are working very closely with, all right, coming together to address this challenge. So for midstream in the area of transportation and handling, we are working very closely with companies like Kawasaki Heavy Industry, Linde, Mitsui OSK Line, and Royal Vopak to look at how we can basically export hydrogen in its liquid form. We call it liquid hydrogen. From, let's say, for example, from Australia to Singapore, regasify this liquid hydrogen to gaseous hydrogen and introduce it to our hydrogen power plant, 100% H2 power plant, okay, that we are now working very closely with Mitsubishi Heavy Industry on. Right. So the entire midstream value chain is something which I've gotten the commitment of my partners to work very closely with Capital, to look at delivering this, meeting the timeline of 2027, 2028. Now, going upstream, of course, the hydrogen production side is something which is very important to us. So we are exploring with various hydrogen producers from Middle East, Australia, as well as from New Zealand. All right. So the price of hydrogen at this point in time is pretty much driven by the cost of renewables energy. So as of now, we do see that the price points of renewable energy in the respective countries coming down as more and more companies are investing into REs, as well as also to the cost of electrolyzer coming down as well. So I think in time to come by 2025, we do see the possibility of the price point of hydrogen coming down to a level that is very acceptable to us, especially in Singapore. Okay, when we imported to Singapore, the levelized cost of hydrogen and then the levelized cost of energy associated with that will be something that our clients are very comfortable with. Okay, with that option, we would be able to ascertain that we have a pathway for energy security, especially when it comes to green electrons, and we are able to generate it here in Singapore. All right. That's all I have from my side. Thank you. Over to you, Paul.
Great. Thanks, Dennis. Really interesting to hear what Keppel is doing on the supply side to address their sustainability issues. And of course, again, there's a lot of really interesting topics in there that are much wider than just data centers, because the sustainability problem is so much bigger, as Dennis mentioned, than just the technology. It's about how we deal with the renewables or sustainable supply solutions. So if there's any questions on that, please feel free to add them to the Q&A box. Now, we talked a little bit about the demand side for the technology investment, and we've talked a little bit about the supply side for sustainability. And to put this all in context of project finance for the days when Singapore does lift its moratorium, we've got Andrew Roche from Ashurst to talk about, to bring it all together from the project finance lens. So Andrew is a project partner at Ashurst, and he has more than 15 years experience in project finance in this region, and has recently actually closed a hyperscale data center deal in Jakarta. So absolutely well placed to talk about project finance implications in Singapore, and he's also going to touch a little bit on the competitiveness of Singapore in that data center market, given some of the concerns raised about the electricity market supply itself. So over to you, Andrew.
Thanks very much, Paul. Let me try and get my screen shared. Just a second. Okay, can everyone see my slides?
Yep, we can see them.
Okay, great. Well, thanks very much, everybody, and particularly for the opportunity to share some thoughts on what is a very interesting subject. I'll be focusing more on how the structure of power markets can impact the development of green data centers. And I'll be looking at comparing the Singapore market with the electricity market in Indonesia, following on from the experience that I had closing a data center limited recourse project financing in Jakarta, as Paul mentioned. And I'll also touch on some of the financing considerations, particularly in the context of project financing a hyperscale data center. So I'll just very quickly touch on a couple of kind of basic points that I think most people know about, and then I'll try to apply these basic points in the context of the Singapore electricity market and also the Jakarta market. So what's obviously critical to powering a green data center is uninterruptible power supply. And as we all know, some sources of renewable electricity are simply not uninterruptible. They're very interruptible, solar and wind in particular. And this obviously poses a challenge to supply green electrons to data centers, at least on an exclusive basis. As far as how a data center accesses its electricity needs, there's the, I suppose, grid connection model. And in that context, you'll have renewable power sources connected to the grid, but it requires a very sophisticated and well-developed grid, which is very, very stable. It has to have significant stability in managing the load from a demand and supply side, and in particular to manage the fluctuating capacity of intermittent renewable energy sources such as solar and wind. For some markets, like Singapore, it's actually possible, of course, to buy your electricity from a grid, but actually link it to a renewable energy plant. And you can do this virtually, in effect, or through contract for differences, where there's a contracted strike price, which effectively hedges the power cost without an actual transfer of green electrons. Now, whether or not that will be sufficient, particularly in the Singapore context, when one takes into account the moratorium here, will actually be an interesting policy choice for the Singapore government to make. But it is actually possible, and we're seeing this as part of a number of the rooftop solar projects which are being developed in Singapore. The owner of the property which is developing the rooftop solar generating capacity can actually enter into virtual PPAs or contracts for differences with electricity buyers. So there's actually a direct linkage there. Another option, of course, is what I've called captive or off-grid. And this is actually quite relevant to what Dennis was talking about before when he was talking about the hydrogen supply chain and importing green hydrogen from afar, abroad, as far as the Middle East, Australia, and other countries outside of Singapore, and actually using the green hydrogen to generate what would effectively be green electricity and supplying that directly to a data center. Now, of course, particularly in Singapore, land availability is a significant issue there, which I'm sure Dennis is all over in the context of his projects. And of course, given the interruptible nature of solar and wind in particular, it's not realistic to build a captive or off-grid dedicated solar or wind energy project to supply directly to a data center. The data center would actually need the ability to plug into the grid to purchase electricity to plug the gaps from the solar and wind electricity sources. So let's move on to just comparing the Singapore and Jakarta markets, because they are very, very different in the context of how the electricity market is structured. And this does raise different issues for each jurisdiction when considering how to decarbonize the supply of electricity to data centers. So Singapore, we all know that it's a world-leading data hub. It has a very sophisticated and integrated and stable power grid with an open electricity market. Data centers are free to choose which electricity supplier they wish to purchase their electricity from. But as we all know, there's limited land availability in Singapore for adding renewable energy generation capacity. Both P.S. Lee and Dennis have talked about other options, rooftop solar, floating solar, and also the Singapore government's initiative to import renewable energy from neighbouring countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, and also beyond actually. There's intergovernmental agreements which contemplate the import of hydropower electricity as far away as Laos via Thailand and Malaysia. That, of course, will have its own challenges with grid upgrading connectivity issues, as well as potential additional capex to build out the transmission network. As I mentioned before, on-grid solutions linking the renewable energy generating capacity to data centers are available through virtual PPAs and contracts for differences, and off-grid captive power plants are a potential solution, as I mentioned before. And also just in the context of building, for example, an off-grid or captive power plant which supplies electricity to a data center, there's actually the ability to connect it to the grid and sell excess energy into the grid, which can be helpful from a economics perspective, and it could actually pave the way for a data center to rely on a captive interruptible renewable energy source as well. So that's Singapore. Jakarta, very, very different market. I won't go into the details about the data center and just digital economy generally, but we all know Jakarta and Indonesia more broadly is just a huge growth market. There's high population density, 176 million internet users, and the digital infrastructure network in Indonesia and particularly Jakarta is actually being built out. So we're seeing a lot of activity in Jakarta in terms of the construction of new data centers, and we're seeing the hyperscalers show some interest there as well. Jakarta is a very well-connected subsea cable hub. I think it's the second most densely connected hub after Singapore, and there are plans afoot to expand the connectivity of Jakarta as well. So very exciting. And then there's obviously huge renewable energy potential in Jakarta, which is in the process of being realized with a variety of renewable energy sources from hydro, solar, and also geothermal energy as well. Now, the issues, the challenges in Jakarta, there are grid stability issues and lack of connectivity between regional grids, which can actually make it very, very difficult to build, say, a geothermal power plant in one part of Indonesia and import that energy into, say, Jakarta, for example. And the other structural limitation, I suppose, in the Indonesian market is, unlike Singapore, which is an open market, a very competitive retail energy supply business, in Indonesia, you have a state-owned enterprise utility, which is a de facto monopoly supplier of power to end users. So it's actually very, very difficult to purchase electricity from anyone other than PLN. Now, there are exceptions for that. So there are a number, I think 40 or 41 industrial estates, designated industrial estates throughout Indonesia, principally focused around Jakarta. And the license holder of the industrial estate does have the ability to supply power to users of the industrial estate. And there's also a way, actually, if PLN does not wish to sell electricity to a particular buyer, for an independent power plant to sell electricity to a data center, for example. So there are challenges in Indonesia as well. I just want to say a few words on just some lessons learned from financing hyperscale data centers. on a project financing basis. So where the financiers look to the cash flows generated from the data center through charging end users to use the data center facilities to repay the loans provided to the owner of the data center to construct and develop the data center. And for a hyperscaler data center, it's actually an eligible candidate to be project financed, because you've got the massive global technology companies, the Facebooks, the Googles, the Amazons, the Alibabas, etc., who are very highly credit rated. And given their large data storage needs, they can really scale up. That's why they're called hyperscalers, and they can contract on a long-term basis. So what it does is, from a financing perspective, it de-risks the revenue stream, because you have effectively a single high credit who is contracting on a long-term basis for agreed capacity. Now, some of the, I guess, lessons learned from project financing a hyperscale data center. The hyperscaler customer tends to contract on a phase-by-phase basis in line with its projected customer demands. So what that means is that the full capacity of the intended data center might not be fully contracted on day one, but it will be built out over time. So that actually relies on the hyperscaler actually exercising its option to expand. So that has a number of implications. What data center developers will typically like to do, based on its expectations of market demand, is oversize the shell and core construction of the data center in anticipation that the hyperscaler customer will actually exercise its expansion rights and demand more capacity. So that results in higher upfront capex, which poses some financing challenges. And of course, that means that the data center will actually need to carefully plan its power supply strategy so that it has access to additional power supply in line with the hyperscaler customer building out its capacity. So there are some interesting financing issues which need to be addressed to take into account these considerations. So I think that's all I really wanted to touch on from a financing perspective. I could spend a lot more time talking about it and go into a lot more detail, but perhaps leave that for the Q&A. So back to you, Paul.
Thanks, Andrew. And I'm sure you could, and I'm sure we are all interested to hear that. So yeah, as Andrew infers, keep those questions coming. I think it was really useful to have that comparison from the regional perspective, because Singapore with the moratorium is perhaps risking its competitiveness in the data center market, and there is huge demand coming from the region. And certainly some of the giant tech companies, we know that they are looking all around the region for major developments. So providing that context is very useful. And before I get into the Q&A, there's one burning question I do want to ask with respect to the impact the moratoriums actually had on data center development in Singapore. So I'm going to ask that of PS just to help set the scene a little bit. We talk about the demand growth of 13% or 12.9% for data centers, but yet in Singapore, we're seeing a projected growth rate of 5% up until 2024. What's your view on the effect the moratorium has had on the growth rate in data centers, or do you think there's other factors as well as the moratorium which are determinant in driving that 5% number in Singapore?
I think if the moratorium is not lifted soon, the investor will be compelled to consider other Southeast Asian countries as viable alternative for them. So while there's upside for ASEAN neighbors in terms of attracting the data center projects, right? So Singapore definitely would experience a depressed growth rate. Yeah. But I think the moratorium that can also spur innovations within the Singapore DC industry. So I think I briefly mentioned that in my presentation. So I think the one initiative that I'm currently leading is actually the Sustainable Tropical Data Center Testbed initiative, co-funded by both our National Research Foundation and Facebook. So I think the solutions that actually developed here can benefit the DC industry in the region. So I think it can still bring about economic opportunities. Yeah, it's just that I think probably we need to look broader, right? Instead of just focusing on the growth rate within Singapore. I think we need to really look at the regional picture, right? So how can we help promote the growth of this industry in Southeast Asia region, and obviously unlocking the financial or economic values?
Cool, thanks, PS. Just bear with me, I'm having a small technology issue. My computer's locked up here, so apologies just for a second. Okay, sorry, I'm back. Thanks for that answer, PS. And I agree, focusing on the actual, not the growth rate, but the regional picture is very important. So I'm just going to start to visit some of the questions in the chat, and I do want to revisit some that Sean has answered, but perhaps we'll do it in a slightly different way. I want to just return to Andrew briefly and talk about a little bit about technology, and perhaps in answering this question, you could touch on the cybersecurity issue. So given the investment in technological solutions and sorry, my computer's completely frozen. Oh, I'm very sorry about this. Okay, sorry, I'm back. So sorry, here we go. Now, considering the investment in technology locally, and despite some of the major players, the hyperscalers outsourcing their construction, some of that technology that they're carrying is going to be proprietary. And how do you foresee this leading to? How do you foresee this manifesting in risk management for development of data centers in Singapore? And also, how does that compare with project financing for co-located data centers, which also might be at the hyperscale end of the market?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. I don't know about, just in terms of proprietary technology, the risk that, it can be, uplifted or copied or whatever. But just from a general perspective, security issues are a huge concern. Obviously, for data center customers, the data center operator who might be liable to its customers for breaching security. But also for financiers who are looking to finance a data center, because if their customer's liable, if their borrower, the data center operator, is liable to customers, then that's a significant potential risk for the project. So what tends to happen is that lenders will appoint a technical advisor, and that technical advisor will crawl all over the data center operator's security practices and protocols. Both from a physical security perspective, which might be, Paul, what you were referring to in the context of proprietary solutions actually installed in the data center by the end user customer, but also just from general cybersecurity perspective. And one of the interesting aspects about that, given the potentially huge liabilities in play here, is the availability of insurance. So there is actually an insurance market that's developed to provide insurance for cybersecurity losses. It's a developing market. It's expensive to purchase. There are lots of exclusions, limited cover, high deductibles, but it is something which financiers typically require. Now, of course, a data center operator will push back on this because they will insist that their data security practices and protocols are more than sufficient. But given that it's such a high risk area with potential huge liabilities. I think the insurance market is an important way to mitigate that risk.
Excellent. And from Dennis, from your perspective as a data center developer, I mean, do you have a similar view on these security issues as Andrew just mentioned?
Yes, definitely. But for us, we are a bit different. We operate in a different part of the value chain. So for us, it's more towards physical security. There's a lot of concern for our clients. So we being a wholesale co-location provider, so we will own and operate data center on behalf of our client. But for us, we don't really dabble into their IT equipment, their IT resources, their compute resources, and so forth. Right. But having said that, yes, physical security is something that is a must-have, and we apply various technologies and so forth to help us mitigate any risk from that perspective.
Cool, thanks. Okay, so just while we're talking to Dennis and about Keppel's view on the world, there is an interesting question here that's come through the chat box from Derek Murray. It's theoretically, what would be more sustainable for the future demand in Singapore? And this is pretty relevant to Keppel, since you have been looking at data centers in other countries, and you've also been looking at both demand and supply side. So do you think it would be theoretically more sustainable to provide new and upgraded infrastructure to connect overseas power to Singapore data centers? Or are you thinking it would be more sustainable to offshore data centers near the renewable sources and then bring the infrastructure into Singapore to get the IT infrastructure to connect? Yeah.
Okay, I think it's a very good question. It all depends. At the end of the day, it all depends on our clients, how comfortable they are with offshore data centers. All right. So at this point in time, we do see there's a pent-up demand for data centers. There's a reason why they want to be in Singapore. All right. For political reasons, for stability reasons, Singapore is an excellent place for co-location, like what PSC has shared in a couple of slides. So our clients are asking for DCs to be built, and operated in Singapore. But unfortunately, because of the moratorium, we do see some challenges in terms of our clients wanting more space and power, having no choice but to look outside of Singapore. So having said that, for Keppel, we are also following our clients, all right? For example, into Indonesia, into Malaysia, into Vietnam, into Thailand. So they do want us to scale with them. So we are looking at ways in which we can not just build, own, and operate physical data centers for our clients in offshore data centers, but we are also in the process of looking at how we can build this digital highway as well from Singapore to their respective locations, just to support them scaling up. All right. So for us, this is how we go about doing it. So for offshore, as of now, we do see requests, but having said that, the preference is for our clients especially, to have it in Singapore, to have the IT infrastructure in Singapore.
Okay. Thanks, Dennis. That's a great answer. And there's a few things I want to come back to that you mentioned, but first I just want to readdress this moratorium, because it is clearly a big elephant in the room. And with a strong desire to have the data center development in Singapore from the clients, that's creating the demand for data centers in Singapore, and we know Singapore is an attractive market. So, PS, I want to ask you, in terms of, you talked about the terms and conditions for exiting the moratorium. I think it's pretty clear what needs to be done, and we're clearly seeing a huge appetite from industry to actually do what needs to be done, exactly the kind of things we've been talking about today. But I'm really interested from how the government's utilised that time that they've brought themselves, and to where they've got to with developing the frameworks, the technical standards, and the policies that would actually communicate a clear pathway out of the moratorium to the developers. And if we're still in the realms of a policy shift, or where the government's actually at now.
I think we will need to look at the relevant design standards and codes, and actually adapting them to really drive the sustainability, the objective, right? So I think currently we have the Singapore standard, right? The Sustainable Data Center SS564, as well as the BCA IMDA, the green mark for data center, both for existing data center and new data center. So in all likelihood, I think for the data center, it will actually go through the development which is similar to that of commercial building, because you take reference to the green mark for commercial buildings, right? So they have over the years, VCF actually raised the bar, right, to drive the built environment, right, to be greener. So I think for data center, likely that they will also go through the same kind of process as well, right? For example, again taking reference from the commercial building, now they have the super low energy building, SLEB. So likely, I think we will also see the authorities, right, raising the bar, right? For example, even the mandating minimum PUE and WUE, right, for new data centers that are going to come online in the next couple of years, and maybe even actually imposing certain standards for brownfield data centers, right? Because if you really want to sort of leave the sustainability for the whole DC industry, it's not just the greenfield data center, but also the brownfield data center. Yeah, so I think the process, I think it has to be very consultative. I think certainly they need to get the feedbacks and input from the DC operators, and probably also working with researchers, right? But I think researchers are actually pushing the boundary in terms of the technology innovations. But I think end of the day, it has to be really a platform needs to be around where all the DC industry, the stakeholders can come together and then to look at what are some of the tweaks, right? Be it pertaining to policy, be it in terms of technology developments, right? So as to really align the interest to push the sustainability agenda for the DC industry.
Thank you. Thanks, Piers. Great stuff. So just to go back to revisit Dennis's earlier discussion on the previous question. One thing that I'm very curious about in Singapore personally is something that's come up a few times, and that's the space constraint and other issues that are affecting development in Singapore. How does Keppel view the commercial aspects of developing in Singapore, considering some of the things that Andrew mentioned, given the type of constraints that we have are not just with the moratorium, but with actual land constraints and power supply issues? What's Keppel's view on that, and especially in terms of its grand vision for the scale of data centers the customers are desiring here in Singapore?
Okay. Land constraint will always be there. Like this is inherent to Singapore, right? But the question would be, how can we be creative and build out the DC such that we max it out and meet our clients' requirement, as well as of course the return on investment from our perspective as well. So this is always something that's on our mind. We are always looking at ways in which you can do it better, build it better, cheaper, better, faster. That's what we always say for our clients. Right. So yes, high-rise data center is one option. Okay, where we optimize the use of land. Other than that, we are also exploring or working towards floating data centers where we leverage on the sea space for data centers. All right. So these are two things which we are actively pursuing for not just for our own interest, but also for our clients who came to us with these requirements as well. So having the ability to say, for example, build floating data centers, nearshore floating data centers and so forth, leveraging and the seawater for cooling. Basically, when you leverage the seawater as a heat sink, there will be practically zero water usage. All right. So you're basically leveraging the sea to eject the warmer air from the DC hall into the sea, for example. So this is just one option we are looking at. Of course, for high-rise data center, there are other form of challenges as well. So that's where we started to look at ways in which we can have what we call an embedded power generation. It means having our own power plant, which is of close proximity to the data centers, for example, to minimize the losses. And then coupled with the fact that if it's consuming hydrogen, the green hydrogen as the fuel, so the electrons coming out from these data centers will power the green high-rise DC, for example, or even the green floating data center for existing brownfield projects or projects that we have around Singapore, assets that we have around Singapore. If we are able to say export this green electrons into the grid, all our DCs in Singapore can practically draw down these green electrons through the grid and can declare themselves green overnight. So these are things which are our clients are hoping that we run a bit faster, okay, to achieving it. So timeline is given to us that by 2025, they hope to see a possible solution, not just from Keppel Data Center, but for the whole of Singapore. So this is why I'm actively looking into how we can bring in the large volume of hydrogen to Singapore, combusting it, and probably exporting it to the grid. If not, then we do it in the private version, meaning embedded power generation approach for nearby data centers.
That is excellent, of course. And something to explore would be perhaps in a minute would be just about that's a step removed from the actual technical standards that PS was talking about. So it's more about the it's a bigger policy issue with in respect to enabling that supply chain. But before I ask you that question, I just want to take Andrew's views on what you've said here. Given the competition and given the innovation that's going on in Singapore, we're actually looking at quite a fundamentally different development scenario for these large-scale data centers. And from a risk perspective and a project finance perspective, I'm curious if you've got any views on how that would manifest in the finance of these major developments.
Yeah. So, well, Dennis has covered a lot of different potential solutions. You know, the importing of green hydrogen into Singapore is super exciting because it's not just the combustion of that hydrogen to create green energy to power a data center. It's the entire value chain from source through liquefaction, transportation, effectively regasifying it back into hydrogen. So there are many pieces to that value chain, all of which can be project financed or perhaps could be project financed on a purely integrated basis. So that's just enormously huge potential. And it's actually analogous to LNG projects in many ways, except that ultimately it's green electrons. So that's very exciting. And then as far as the other solutions are concerned, I mean, we're seeing it already, you know, with the Solar Nova rollout of the rooftop solar projects. You know, we're seeing some of the tech giants actually contract with some of the rooftop solar generators. So that's already happening as well. And whether that can be project financed or not, I think depends significantly on how much of the capacity is actually contracted and how the offtake actually works. But there's certainly potential there.
Excellent. And just to encourage people to keep the questions coming on, I mean, if you weren't aware that Keppel have just basically, Dennis has just, you know, admitted that Keppel is looking at, you know, focusing on, you know, converting Singapore from an oil and gas trading hub to basically a hydrogen terminal. So you know, this is big picture stuff, which is why energy and utilities are so interested in data centers as well. So keep the questions coming in. Now, Dennis, just on that, and I'm going to return to one of the questions, some of the highly technical questions in a minute, but I just want to wrap up that discussion in terms of the bigger picture that you're talking about, and we're talking about an input of hydrogen as a solution for all of Singapore. Much like the question I asked PS about where the policy is for enabling that exit from the moratorium through technical standards, how do you foresee the pathway in Singapore for your basically your supply side solution for data centers? And I appreciate this is a bit off the topic of data centers themselves, but it is super relevant.
Okay, I think first and foremost, I would like to mention that from the engineering perspective, I think this is something achievable. Okay, of course, Keppel can't do everything on our own. That's why we very much leverage on the partners who are experts in the relative field. For example, like the LH2 vessels, so we're talking about the Kawasaki Heavy Industries has already built a prototype. They are looking into commercializing a large-scale LH2 vessel by 2027, 2028 timeline, which is very much aligned to what they're trying to achieve as well. So other partners like Linde, for example, they are one of the market leaders in terms of liquefaction technology, regasification technology. So we work with like-minded partners like this to help us to build this entire value chain. So from the engineering perspective, I do see the possibility of that happening by 2025, 2026 kind of timeline. Okay, having said that, we also need to focus very much on the hydrogen producer side of things. So we can have the infrastructure, but the hydrogen production is not ready, then that defeats the purpose as well. So therefore, we are also very actively engaging hydrogen producers, like I mentioned, in Australia, Middle East, and New Zealand, okay, to see how we can help them or work closely with them to expedite the whole process of producing the much needed hydrogen, and then of course liquefying it and so forth to fit into the supply chain infrastructure that I just mentioned. All right, so this is something that is possible, and then I think we can probably see results within the next 5 years. Okay, this is really encouraging. But having said that, I think that the key challenge we have here, especially in Singapore, is regards to policy pertaining to hydrogen import, large-scale hydrogen import. So this is something that's not really, there's no really standards, or there's no really a code just yet for Singapore. So what we are doing now from Kappa's perspective, together with partners, we are now jointly engaging various government agencies to come together to see if we can kickstart this journey, this platform to establish a standard, a code for Singapore with regards to large volume of hydrogen import. So the various government agencies are very supportive about this, so they have committed resources and so forth. I think in time to come, when the engineering infrastructure is ready, I'm very confident that the policies, the side of the policies, I think is also will be ready by then.
Okay, that's certainly exciting, and it's encouraging for the future of data centers in Singapore. Now, I just want to, there's a few open questions in the chat here I just want to touch on with PS. So this one about power quality, PS, I want to frame it slightly differently, because I'm actually, and I think one thing that's come up a little bit in the chat is a little bit about the older data centers, the brownfield data centers, and what's happening with them. And I'm very interested to hear about, firstly, this power quality issue and how potentially improvements. Firstly, you can answer the question that Sanjeev raised about the power quality in the first instance, but also I'm interested to hear about how the new technologies and retrofitting of the data centers can actually contribute towards some of the solutions that Singapore's needing in the actual market itself to address the customers' needs here, and what solutions might be existing from a technical perspective.
Okay, yeah. So maybe first, let me try to address the power quality issue. I think the question was posed by my colleague, Prof. Sanjay Panda, who is a power expert. So I think that my concern is actually the industry seems to be overusing the PUE. Because PUE, by definition, is actually IT plus facilities over IT. So if you actually have improvement in the IT side, right? For example, be it in terms of the more efficient IT architecture, or in the Sanjit case, by addressing the power, the quality issues, right? So basically, you get IT to reduce both for your numerator and denominator, right? So assuming if the cooling power or energy consumption stays constant, then the implication is actually your PUE actually increase. And by the usual sense, you think that it's less efficient, right? You think that the data center is actually less efficient, which is not the case, right? Because obviously improvement in the power quality or the IT side, right, actually serve to reduce the total power consumption of the data center, right? But then because of the limitation with such a simple definition of PUE, right, people may actually kind of had this misconception that the data center becomes less efficient, right? Although I think Sanjay actually then added a point about the improvement in the power quality can also translate to the reduction in the cooling system energy consumption, which is the case. But so I think it's always a case of relative magnitude, right? If let's suppose the savings in the cooling the system energy consumption is achieved at a slower rate compared to your power quality energy savings for the IT side, then your PUE will still increase. So I think it's really in the details, but I think moving forward, if we are really going to drive the sustainability, the agenda for data center, I think we need to look at a more comprehensive sets of matrices and not just relying on single indicators. Yeah.
Okay. So I guess in a layman, for me, being not a data center expert, some of these lesser efficient data centers that are existing in Singapore. We know there's 60 odd of the centers. Do you see there as technical solutions that can address some of these older data centers, and do you think that's a viable road in Singapore to also help out with the moratorium by making the existing set more efficient?
Sure. So I think the challenge of sort of improving the energy efficiency for brownfield or existing data centers is certainly greater compared to greenfield data center, right? For greenfield data center, from day one, you can pretty much incorporate the greener solutions design, right, into your data center design. But brownfield, because you have like sunk in investment, right, in terms of your infrastructures, right? For example, in particular cooling. So that's why I think just the technology solution alone or innovation alone, I think it is not going to make it. I think you need to pair-track this with innovative business model, right? So just to give an example, right? Just lately, we have been doing the test bedding with a major co-location operator, right? So if you look at co-location, is actually a very interesting model, right? Because any saving, right? When you, for example, do a retrofit of brownfield data centers, right? To maybe from traditional or conventional air cooling to liquid cooling, the infra, the savings comes to the operator, right? But then it's actually the end user that procures the IT equipment, right? So if the saving doesn't get transferred to the end user, right, nothing will move, correct? Because they won't be the one that will be footing the full cost when the saving actually goes towards the operator. So that's why I think along with the technological innovation, there's really the need for us to look into innovative business model, right? So that when these two come together, it's really a win-win arrangement for all parties involved. I think end of this is really about alignment of interest, right, in order to really push on the sustainability agenda.
Thanks for that, PS. So I just will put one last call for questions out. Otherwise, we might start to look to wrap up this event. So if you do have any questions that you want to raise in the Q&A, please go ahead. But I do actually, just on that last point that PS wrapped up on, I do want to ask Dennis and Andrew both in turn to comment on that last point about what working together into the sustainability agenda there. So Dennis, I guess from Keppel's perspective, how that ties in with, if you're looking at these, working on solutions for brownfield as well as wider industry, I guess. And I know that you guys are involved in the government funded project as well. So yeah.
I think that's a very interesting, I think, topic of discussion. Okay, for brownfield data centers, I think most of these data centers has been around for quite some time. So I think for them to have a pathway to go green or go improve their efficiency, it's going to be very, very challenging. So having said that, that's why from Keppel's perspective, we are working very closely with other data centers operators as well, their needs and upgrade, for example, right? So we are now working very closely with them, detailed discussion with them, look at ways in which we can, in fact, build a greener data center, okay, assuming that the power, the green electrons can come in time for them as well. So for them to actually migrate from the existing infrastructure or existing DCs, the older DCs, to a newer DCs that is powered by green electrons. So we are giving this migration option to other data centers operators out there in Singapore as well. So this is one way in which I believe Keppel, we can contribute to this data center industry to actually drive down the PUE, much needed PUE numbers on one hand, at the same time enabling all the data centers in Singapore to go green as well. So this is one very high level approach which we are doing, and I'm glad to say that we have been approached by a lot of data centers operators themselves coming to us, asking for a possible solution when they heard that we are pursuing this hydrogen pathway.
That's fantastic. And Andrew, just again, with the same sort of focus of putting a finance lens on these kind of approaches, do you have any views on this?
Not really, actually, Paul. I think by the time a data center gets to the point where it's brownfield with old tech, the lenders are out. So they care less.
Yeah. Yeah, okay, fair enough. So we'll just take one more question before we go to the closing remarks. It's just popped up in the chat, and definitely one for UPS. The idea of data center embassies. So firstly, you can explain that to me, and then perhaps you can see if you got a view on that. Is Singapore open to the idea of data center embassies?
Is a question for me or for somebody?
Well, I think, yeah, you can. I'm going to put that question towards you, yes.
Oh, okay. Actually, I'm not too familiar with the concept of data center embassy. Maybe I think Andrew or Dennis can take the question.
Yes, I think that's a very interesting concept and approach, data center embassies. So we at Keppel, in Singapore, we have been approached as well from the neighboring countries as well to establish data center embassies and so forth. So this is a very interesting, like I said, approach. But having said that, we need to be very mindful of which government we are dealing with. All right, and then of course stability of the government itself, and then ensuring that this data center embassy concept will continue to reside even though there's any changes at the political level and so forth. So this is very important. But having said that, again, clients are also very mindful. So even though it's a data center embassy per se in another country, but the jurisdiction there is different. So they are also very mindful of that as well. So I can't really assess ascertain at this point in time whether the clients are for or against data center embassies.
Okay, excellent. Thanks to Dennis for answering that one. So I think we'll look to go to the closing remarks now. I mean, I just want to say thanks to the panelists. One obviously great thing is with the exponential rise in data centers, and let's say, for example, now that data centers account for 0.3% of the world's carbon emissions, with the huge growth in data centers, that could significantly grow, which is very counterproductive to what we're trying to achieve. And of course, flying is about 3% of emissions or something like that, 3 to 4%. So without the kind of solutions that have been discussed here today, I guess we would be going down the path of having, data shame in the future because of the amount of carbon emissions associated with using the data that we consume on a daily basis. So as a consumer, it's very important that it's gratifying to hear that many of these sustainability issues are being addressed from my perspective. So thanks everybody, and I'll let Lorena wrap up.
Thanks, Paul. And thank you so much to our speakers today, especially for your openness and your generosity of the knowledge that you shared with us today. There's so much today that we need to unpack that I actually would encourage everyone to revisit the recording, because there was so much that came out and a lot of learnings from today's session. So thank you very much for joining us today. Just to do a quick wrap up of some of the events that we have coming up. So early next week, we have the 22nd Annual Business Awards, which obviously will be done virtually. On the 5th of October, the next day, we'll have Closing the Gender Attrition Gap event, again, another webinar. On the 12th of October, how to embed diversity and inclusion into your hiring process. We also have at the end of October, as part of the SIEW think tank, we're going to be hosting a roundtable on the net zero COP26 trade opportunities on the journey to decarbonising ASEAN. And then, of course, on early November, climate change mission. So we're going to be hosting this via the Glasgow Chamber of Commerce. Again, obviously a webinar given the weather's location, but these are fantastic events coming up that we really encourage everybody to participate in and to join us for. So without further ado, thank you again so much to our speakers and also to all of you for joining us today. And just a gentle reminder that soon you'll have a survey entering your inboxes, and we invite you all to please provide us some feedback on today's session, as well as other topics that you might want to explore on the back of what we heard today. So thank you very much.